We begin this afternoon with the latest information coming out of Syria. President Bashar al-Assad now says that the Israeli airstrikes on Syria over the weekend amount to a declaration of war. He also warns that options are on the table for retaliation. This opens up the possibility for violence raging in Syria to actually cross the borders and transition into a regional conflict. Yesterday, the White House commented on the Israeli airstrikes on Syria, saying weapons transfers to Hezbollah are of concern. They went on to say that Israel has a right to respond in, quote, their own sovereign interests. Meanwhile, Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Robert Menendez has introduced legislation that would arm Syrian opposition groups, but the bill goes further than that. It would also provide military training as well as non-lethal aid to rebel groups that have been vetted. And Senator Menendez is not alone in his demands for action. Senator John McCain and numerous Republicans are calling for an American response as well. This proposed legislation to back the rebels comes at an interesting time during this conflict, and that is because a leading member of the United Nations Independent Commission on Inquiry on Syria actually told Swiss TV on Monday that there's evidence suggesting that rebel forces and not President Assad's army might have been the ones using chemical weapons. The UN itself distanced itself from those remarks, saying that they have not yet reached conclusive evidence on the use of chemical weapons in Syria. So obviously there is a lot of information unfolding about the country right now. To help me break it all down, RT correspondent Anastasia Churkina. Hi there, Anastasia. Let's start off with the most recent developments. Secretary of State John Kerry is visiting with Sergei Lavrov, his Russian counterpart, in Moscow today. What came of these talks?
Well, Megan, certainly what came out of this talks was quite unexpected in a sense, because while the war drums are beating here in the United States with certain lawmakers proposing bills that would indicate following steps of U.S. heavy involvement in Syria, we did hear a more lighter talk come out of these negotiations in Moscow earlier today. Basically, what we heard was that John Kerry has said that the U.S. and Russia have similar positions on the Syrian crisis, and that they both believe, the two countries, that to solve the Syrian crisis, everybody needs to stick to the Geneva Communique roadmap for creating a transitional government in Syria, which was outlined in June last year. And both Russia and the United States, according to Kerry and Lavrov, believe that this is still the most tangible way of trying to come up with to a solution in Syria. And they both basically are saying that the opposition and the Syrian government need to create a transitional government that would manage affairs on the ground, and this, hopefully, according to them, only negotiations would put a solution to the events unraveling there.
Now, obviously, both the U.S. and Russia have to look at this situation, being two of the most powerful countries that have influence over in Syria, and really consider what they could do in terms of an international response to this crisis. Was there any indication of, other than negotiations, of what could possibly be happening? And was there any indication of Secretary Kerry getting Russia on the same page as the U.S. at this point?
No, Megan, certainly at this point, negotiations are all we have outlined, at least at this meeting in Moscow. That's all they've come out to say, that they do believe that negotiations are the only way to dealing with this crisis. Certainly, the U.S. and Russia do remain split on whether or not there should regime change should occur on the ground. Of course, the United States believes that to be the case. Russia doesn't. But from what we heard today, they still believe that this roadmap, the existing one of a transition government, is the key to achieving success on the ground.
Now, obviously, Secretary Kerry is in Moscow right now talking about all these different aspects of the crisis in Syria. Back here at home, as I had mentioned, Senator Robert Menendez actually made this proposal legislation to possibly arm rebel troops on the ground that have been vetted. Can you talk about the timing of this proposed bill with the Israeli airstrikes this past weekend, and also that UN inquiry that we've been talking about, saying that those chemical weapons might have been used by Syrian rebels and not the Syrian government?
Megan, the timing is very curious in the sense that there are so many different positions existing on the situation right now. We have Lavrov and Kerry talking about negotiations. We have U.S. lawmakers suggesting, getting involved more heavily on the ground. We do know that there's been a ton of finger pointing surrounding whether or not it was the Syrian government that had used chemical weapons in the crisis, whether it was the opposition that had used the chemical weapons. Certainly a lot of finger pointing. Certainly the situation is at a boiling point. And this particular bill, what it does is kind of pushes for further U.S. involvement. Specifically, it suggests that a $250 million fund be created for the transition process, to speed up the transition process on the ground, but also calls for U.S. to provide arms and military training and non-lethal aid in Syria to the opposition groups, as well as would basically, if it were to come through and be approved and become a law, that Washington would have the right to impose sanctions on individuals providing oil and arms to the Syrian government. But this is only in its first stages. This has to go through the committee itself and then the Senate and the House of Representatives to be signed by Obama. So we're going to have to wait and see if that happens, and that would mean a new push, a unilateral push from the U.S.
And Anastasia, a lot of the critics of this bill and of the idea of intervention in Syria actually have said that there's, first of all, no way to be able to vet these rebels and figure out which ones are actually going to send that money, that fund money, to al-Qaeda. We know some of them are actually linked with al-Qaeda, so there's a lot of questions. But let me ask you this. There is also a number of safety nets for the Syrian country for the U.S. not to be involved. There's the UN, for instance, and the Security Council. There's also the Arab League. So can you talk about these safety nets and also possibly talk about the fact that the U.S. is the one that is saying we might need to step up?
Well, it's the U.S. and its kind of Western allies definitely trying to kind of push more action at this point. But it's, we still have to keep in mind that it's very split opinions. It's lawmakers, it's people who are actually dealing with the Syrian crisis directly. And certainly there are safety nets, and the UN has been a major one, like in this particular scenario, because of Russia and China blocking U.S. attempts to intervene in Syria more heavily. This has not been the case. And it seems like this is a position that's going to stick around. So while the United Nations exists, the United Nations Security Council, the U.S. is not going to be able to just plow through any international collaboration without getting others involved.
RT correspondent Anastasia Churkina reporting from New York.